Hello and welcome to another episode of Locked On Wolves. Today on the show, revisiting first half predictions, or I guess preseason predictions. How has the unofficial first half of the season gone according to my predictions, the Western Conference, a couple of Wolves predictions, just kind of checking in on that. How have I done so far? Also, a little bit of trade deadline cleanup, a couple more reports out there related to what the Wolves almost did at the deadline, and a spin through some of the buyouts league-wide as well. Ant's comments at AllStar break. It's all upcoming on the show. Welcome in. You are Locked On Wolves.
You are Locked On Timberwolves, your daily Minnesota Timberwolves podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Wolves podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Ben Beecken. I'm the host of Locked On Wolves. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, official sportsbook of Locked On. Make every moment more. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn today to get started. Happy Tuesday, everybody. We are only 3 days away from the start of the unofficial second half of the season for the Wolves. We're almost there. It's been 5 days since the last Wolves game, so it's starting to feel like a long time, right? The longest gap we've had in between Wolves games since back before the season started in October. So we're getting there. Plenty to get to today, though. First, a big thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere. That includes YouTube as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. Wherever you listen to podcasts, you can find Locked On Wolves. That also includes the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. You can catch all the Minnesota Locked On podcasts, more great local sports coverage 24/7, again, for free. Just download the Locked On Sports Minnesota app today on Roku and Amazon Fire TV. You can also follow the show on Twitter at Locked On T-Wolves and at Beecken, and that's with 2 B's, 2 E's, CKEN. All right, I want to start today with kind of revisiting my preseason predictions related to, first of all, Western Conference predictions, because without in my head, I was thinking I was way off on the Western Conference. I actually did okay. So I want to do that first. And then I also have been a little bit wrong on a couple of Timberwolves related predictions. So we'll go through all those here first. And just kind of take stock where we're at. We're 74% of the way through the Timberwolves schedule. So really 3/4 of the way through, not half, because the schedule's so weird and so lopsided this year. The Wolves playing 61 games before the All-Star break. So I want to do all that. And then later we'll get to some trade deadline cleanup, a few things that Darren Wilson said on his podcast this week. So all that's upcoming here on the show. All right, first, the Western Conference. So before the season, I did a prediction show and I listed out who I thought would be the top 10 teams in the West. I didn't bother ranking who I thought would be the top or the bottom 4, but really, the I guess through the play in the Western Conference. And my recollection was that I was way off. And in reality, I was as far off about the Wolves as I was anybody else. In fact, I only missed, I know the season's not over, but sitting here right now, I missed the Wolves by 4 spots, and I only missed one other team worse than that in the Western Conference besides Sacramento, because I don't think anyone had Sacramento in, what are they, 4th right now in the West? 3rd right now in the West? Yeah, nobody had that. So anyway, here's what I had. I thought when the West was all said and done at the end of the season, Golden State would be first in the Western Conference. That has not been the case. They're currently 9th. They're in a virtual tie for Minnesota, actually, for 8th in the West. 1 fewer loss, but 2 fewer wins than the Timberwolves. So I was way off on Golden State. That was my biggest miss. I had Denver 2nd. They're currently 1st in the West. I had the Clippers 3rd. They're currently 4th in the West. I had the Timberwolves 4th, and they're, of course, 8th, so I missed them by 4 games so far. I had Phoenix 5th. They're currently 5th in the West. I had Memphis 6th. They're up at 2nd in actuality, but this means I have 4 of the top 6 in the West correct in my preseason predictions, which, maybe I'm looking at this glass half full, but I feel like a lot of people had Dallas in the top 6. I think a lot of people had New Orleans in the top 6. Those are probably the 2 that you'd most frequently see in the top 6 that I did not have there. So I don't know. I feel pretty good about 4 of the top 6. Phoenix, exactly right. Denver and the Clippers each within a spot of where they actually are. So that's not too bad. I had Dallas 7th, and they are in 6th currently, and only a half game up on the 7th spot. So, I've basically had Denver, the Clippers. I did have Phoenix correct, and Dallas. I had them all within one spot or exactly correct. I had New Orleans 8th. They're 7th currently. And I know that the argument is, oh, well, Zion, the injury. Well, yeah, that's kind of baked in, right? Like I was anticipating that. I was, I guess, optimistically hoping for continued injury luck for the Timberwolves this year because it was pretty decent last year overall. That hasn't been the case, at least in regards to Karl-Anthony. Well, in general, it hasn't been, right? Towns, extended absence for Taurean Prince, the nagging back spasm for Kyle Anderson, absence for Jordan McLaughlin, knock on wood, and has continued to stay on the floor. But anyway, I was optimistic there. I guess with the Pelicans, I was more realistic, and I was baking in that Zion would miss some time. And sure enough, that they got off to a much better start than I expected. They were top 4 in the West for a very long time. They're currently 7th, and I had them 8th in the West for the end of the season. So I was close there. I had Portland 9th. Portland's currently 12th, and they are, what are they? They're actually only a game out of 9th place because, the West. I had the Lakers 10th. They're currently 13th, and they're 2 games out of 10th place. I did say before the season, you can go back and listen to this. I did say I thought the Thunder and the Jazz would be better than people thought. I thought they'd both be better than the Spurs and Rockets. I thought the Spurs and Rockets would easily be the worst 2 teams in the West. I was correct about that. I did not think the Thunder at the All-Star break would be in 10th place and the Jazz would be in 11th. I thought they would be in some order in 12th and 13th. And I thought it would be, Portland and LA kind of battling it out for that 10 spot, or I guess 9, 10. And then Sacramento. I had Sacramento actually 11 or 12. So I thought it would be in some order Sacramento, Oklahoma City, and Utah in 10, 11, or excuse me, 11, 12, 13. And obviously it was a big miss on the Kings. Not too far off from the Thunder and Jazz, although I will say they've both been a little better, certainly the Jazz, better than I expected them to be this season. So all things considered, Golden State is in 9th. I had them in 1st. The Wolves, I have them in 4th. They're currently in 8th. Those are my only 2 significant misses besides the Kings, which again, I give myself a pass on the Kings, which maybe isn't fair. But I don't know that anybody actually had the Kings. I'm pretty sure nobody did. Had them at 3rd in the West at the All-Star break. We'll see. We'll see if that holds. But Timberwolves related predictions. I talked a lot before the season. I did a couple full shows on Jalen Noel. I thought Jalen Noel would be a really important part of the team. I was right in that sense, right? Jalen Noel has been an important part of the team in that he's had a significant role. Like he was the 6th man for a very long time for the Timberwolves this season, and they relied on him heavily and still do as of now, 61 games into the season. Of course, he has not played well for most of the season. He had that one really good stretch towards the beginning of the year. I think it was kind of November-ish where he played extremely well. And everything that I was hoping for from Jalen Noel came true for those, 2 or 3 weeks, basically. Then he had a really long bad stretch, another quick, decent stretch here more recently. I think it was kind of like late January, early February, and now he's back to struggling again. He's below 30% from 3 for the season. The turnover rate's not where you want it to be. The usage rate is sky high, which we expected, but the efficiency just isn't there. I was expecting him to be a really good fit with Rudy Gobert. I didn't pull his 2-man numbers with Gobert for this segment, but I know it's not good. Like Towns and Noel was the Timberwolves' best 2-man pairing last season, and that was part of my basis for this. It was a relatively small sample, but Noel's 2-man with Towns was better than Anthony Edwards, was better than D'Angelo Russell last year. And I think the skill set of Jalen, which I've always said is kind of a mix between Ant and D'Lo, right? The scoring ability in some ways of Ant, not the athlete, but a better athlete than D'Lo. The passing ability, not quite as good of a passer as D'Lo, but a little bit savvier in pick and roll than Ant in terms of passing the ball. At least that was the idea, right? But I think, in my opinion, what happened with Jalen Noel this season to this point is that he kind of took to heart hey, I'm Jamal Crawford. Like that's the role, right? Similarities. Well, I don't know though. You have the whole Pacific Northwest thing, right? But I do think that obviously different players, but I do think that there's something of a not a complex. I don't know what word I'm looking for, but I truly believe that Jalen Noel thought to himself, okay, well, I got to be the guy. I got to score off the bench. And the Wolves may have told him that because they didn't have much firepower off the bench. No Pat Bev. There's no leader. Not that I guess Beverly started for most last year, but there was no real, like, I'm the second unit guy, right? I mean, Austin Rivers wasn't in the rotation to start the year. Kyle Anderson was coming off the bench, but was never really a scorer type. So Jalen Noel took that to heart and again had some good stretches, but has struggled. I thought he'd be much better than he has been, and I was wrong. Like the free throw rate hasn't been great, the turnover rate hasn't been great. It just hasn't. I thought that Noel would be in the competition for 6 Man of the Year votes. I mean, I did a show on that. Like, I'll be accountable to that because I thought the Wolves would be good, and they've been okay. I thought the Wolves would be better. I thought Noel would be a more visible part of how good the Wolves were this season and their improvement. I thought there would be some Noel, Rudy Gobert pick and roll game. Like, none of that's really come to fruition. And I think clearly the Wolves thought that would be the case too. I mean, Chris Finch talked about this. Moving Malik Beasley and moving Patrick Beverley was going to free up minutes for Jalen Noel, and it did, but Noel has not rewarded them. And I think that's maybe an under-talked about storyline as to why the Wolves' record is what it is, and it isn't any better, is because of that replacing those minutes from Beasley and Beverley with somebody who's a worse offensive player than Beasley. Like, I mean, yes, he could do a few more things, can handle the ball, do some things Beasley doesn't do, but the impact that Noel has had has been less than that of Malik Beasley. And obviously, he's not the defender that Patrick Beverley is, even late career Patrick Beverley. So I think that was a miss for me before the season. I think the Wolves have been disappointed with Noel's performance to this point as well. Now, the season still has, I guess only 21 regular season games left, but there will be ample opportunity for Noel to flip things around. If he can bottle what he did positively in the first half of the season, I think that would be really, really good for the Wolves down the stretch here. All right. I want to get into a couple trade deadline cleanup things. How close were the Wolves to a Bones Hyland deal? My thoughts on Darren Wilson's reporting on that. Some D'Lo extension stuff from the Doogie podcast as well, and then some buyout talk, all that stuff. I also want to talk a little about Anthony Edwards' comments that he made at the All-Star game during his media availability related to load management, rest, etc. So I want to get to all that here next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our title sponsors over at FanDuel. The midway point of the NBA season, unofficial midway point of the NBA season, is here. And now is the perfect time to download FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because new customers get a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000. That's bonus bets back if your first bet doesn't win. Just download the FanDuel Sportsbook app. It's safe, secure, and super easy to use. Then you can bet on everything from the money line to point scores and threes drained. Action picks up here in just a couple days. In the unofficial second half of the NBA season, tons of fun player props. You can also do the exclusive 2 for 3 bet, 2 times 3 bet over at FanDuel. 2 3-pointers scored in the first 3 minutes. That's a bet you can play. So much to do over at FanDuel, and gear up for the unofficial second half of the season. FanDuel even lets you combine your bets for a chance at a bigger payout with a same game parlay. Don't miss the chance to get your no sweat first bet up to $1,000 in bonus bets when you go to FanDuel.com/lockedon. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon to learn more. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NBA. Okay. Cleaning up the trade deadline. So Darren Wilson, of course, of Score North and KSTP in the Twin Cities, has a great podcast, The Scoop, that he does every now and again. It's all things Minnesota sports, not just Timberwolves, but he always has typically has some good Timberwolves nuggets. He had a couple things in his Scoop podcast episode this week. The juiciest one is related to Bones Hyland. He says, and these were his exact words, that the Wolves nearly completed a trade with the Denver Nuggets for Bones Hyland. And he says in the podcast that the Wolves would have done what the Clippers did. The Clippers ended up trading 2 second-round picks for Bones Hyland to Denver. Of course, Bones was, a primary part of their rotation as a guard, a lead guard for them, and then kind of fell out of favor and ended up out of the rotation in Denver. Of course, Timberwolves president of basketball operations, Tim Connolly, was in charge for the last half decade in Denver and drafted Bones Hyland. So it made sense that he would have had interest. Darren Wilson, actually says on the podcast that the Timberwolves would have traded more than the 2 second rounders for Bones Hyland. But there's kind of this thought that Denver was like, all things equal, we'll take a little bit less to kind of screw over Tim Connolly and make this trade with the Clippers. And I don't know, given how petty things were immediately after the Timberwolves hiring of Connolly, you may remember there was some sniping in the media from the Denver ownership group. People they didn't like that the Wolves offered equity, down the road, stuff that they tried to say was, I don't think I'm putting words in mouths at this point, but shady basically was the implication from the Denver side. So yeah, I mean, there's no love lost at the moment between Tim Connolly and the Denver front office. So that's certainly possible that happened. I don't, Darren Wilson didn't mention Taurean Prince, but there had been some previous reporting, and I don't think it was Darren's, but elsewhere, the Nuggets and Wolves had discussed Taurean Prince in a deal for Bones Hyland. I would have seriously considered doing a couple of second rounders for Bones. Like, I think he's a nice player. I would not have traded Taurean Prince and a second rounder or something like that in a potential deal for Bones Hyland. I don't think that would have made a lot of sense. Remember, in this scenario, the Wolves still make the deal for Mike Conley, right? So you still have Mike Conley, you still have Jordan McLaughlin, who the Wolves like a great deal, and obviously he struggled since he came back from the extended layoff. But I mean, still, like, Bones Hyland fits a need in that he can be a scoring guard. But I never thought that trading for Bones Hyland was like this great solution for anything. And it really kind of feels like if the Wolves were considering a pick and Prince or something like that, that they kind of did see it as a solution. Now, Hyland is under contract for one more year, right? He's at the end of his rookie scale deal. So this is year 3. Next year is year 4. And then, of course, you have his restricted free agency rights in the summer of 25. So you'd be getting a year plus of him. But remember, Taurean Prince has a team option for next year, too. The Timberwolves can keep him next year at a reasonable price, or they can trade him. I'm going to pull up exactly what his deal is, but I know he has the option for next year. So the Timberwolves could flip him if they, or I guess flip isn't the best term, but trade Taurean Prince if they want to. And it makes sense from a contractual standpoint. Yeah, non-guaranteed contract for next year. It becomes fully guaranteed actually this summer. So right after the draft, a couple days after the draft, Prince's contract for next year, which is just a hair under $7.5 million. The cap hits, I guess, a little more than $7.5 million. So just a slight raise on this year. So Prince could be traded on draft night this year and be used as an expiring deal, or, a team could keep him next season. And I'm sure that Denver was interested in keeping him for next year for their rotation. I think Prince is more valuable to the Wolves at $7.5 million next year than Bones Hyland would be. Unless the Wolves are thinking like, hey, we could have moved on from Conley this summer, or Conley becomes the bench, Hyland starts and Conley comes off the bench. I don't know. Bones Hyland's fine. I think I'd rather have Conley at, 20 whatever million he'd end up getting next year than Hyland at, I guess the salary's nice, but I just don't know that Bones Hyland is actually the fit for the Wolves that you want. I think he does too many things similar to D'Angelo Russell, who you'd identified as, the Wolves front office had identified as not a fit moving forward. So I think trading Taurean Prince for Bones Hyland would have been a hard pass for me. And obviously it was for the Wolves too, because I guess we don't know for sure if that's what the Nuggets turned down, but the Wolfson comments makes it sound like the Wolves kind of backed off Prince and maybe offered a couple of seconds or something, like maybe a second and Prince, who knows? But I'm glad that it didn't get done if Prince would have been involved. I think Taurean Prince, his presence, his defensive switchability, his three-point shooting. I know Bones can shoot 3, but I talked about this the other day on the show, actually just yesterday on Monday's show, that the Timberwolves are so devoid of like actual plus 3-point shooters that Prince's high 30% is one of the better shooting marks, more consistent marks on the team. So you can't just deal him for a point guard that can shoot. The Wolves just dealt away a point guard that shoots on the ball in D'Angelo Russell instead of a catch and shoot guy like Conley. So I don't think that would have made a ton of sense. I'm glad that it didn't end up happening. Would I have given up a second round pick or 2 for Bones Hyland? Yeah, probably. I would not have traded Taurean Prince for him. I think Prince is too valuable to this year's team and potentially next year's team as well. The one other note that Doogie, that Darren Wilson had on his podcast, was related to D'Angelo Russell, and that Tim Connolly was never really interested in extending D'Angelo Russell. I'd said that on the show constantly, just from a, not from a source perspective, but obviously Tim Connolly didn't want to extend D'Angelo Russell. D'Lo wants more than what the Wolves would have ever paid him. He's not going to get max money regardless, but whatever he gets is going to be more than the Timberwolves would have been willing to pay him because they already identified he wasn't a perfect fit moving forward. He's going to enter into the middle of the prime of his career, right? He's going to get close to, by the end of this next contract, he's going to be out of the prime of his career. He's had some knee issues. For all the reasons we've talked about at length on the show, it makes sense that the Wolves would not necessarily have wanted to extend D'Lo again at anything close to what D'Lo thinks he's worth on the open market. So that all makes a lot of sense. All right. I want to close the show by touching a little bit on some buyouts that happened here the last couple of days and my thoughts on the Wolves not being involved in the buyout market to this point. And then also quickly Ant's comments at the All-Star break about rest and load management for star players. All right, so on the NBA buyout market, the Timberwolves, there was a thought they'd be active, at least in terms of Patrick Beverley, and understandably so. Of course, Pat Bev was a really the heartbeat of last year's team. That combination of Beverley's leadership, veteran leadership, Jared Vanderbilt's activity level, Malik Beasley a little bit of both. That offensive firepower, that brand of kind of frenetic Timberwolves basketball from last year, it's gone now, right? And Patrick Beverley was a heartbeat behind that. There were all these rumors that he was interested in coming back to Minnesota earlier. This was like back in maybe January, or maybe even December, that if there was a trade and he was bought out, there were all those Lakers Bogdanovich rumors to the Pistons that Pat Bev could be bought out and join Minnesota. That's what he wanted to do, et cetera. And we ultimately see him traded to the Orlando Magic and bought out. There's some conflicting reports immediately about the Wolves having interest in bringing him back. I think it was Dane Moore had reported the Wolves were working towards bringing him back, but some national folks, Mark Stein, et cetera, were saying that a reunion was not expected. It never really got to the point where it seemed serious that it was potentially happening. And I said this on the show. I mean, the Wolves had to waive Bryn Forbes as it was. And of course, Forbes has been in the news now for some pretty serious off the court legal issues. After leaving the Wolves, the week after leaving Minnesota. But the Wolves had to waive Forbes after the deadline anyway to make room for Nickeil Alexander-Walker as part of the Conley trade. It was pretty unlikely the Wolves were going to eat more salary and get rid of a veteran to add a veteran, because the only guys you could really justify getting, like, just waiving would be Austin Rivers, whose role Patrick Beverley would take, or I mean, that's really it, right? Like, you're not going to waive Jalen Noel. You're not going to that's pretty much it. You're not probably going to waive Nate Knight. So are you gonna cut Austin Rivers to sign Patrick Beverley? I mean, I'm not saying I wouldn't have, because I think Patrick Beverley brings something. Like Rivers brings something to the Wolves. I think Patrick Beverley brings it something similar, but in a different and maybe more effective way for Minnesota. That's probably what I would have done. But I said all along here on the show, I didn't think the Wolves would do it. I think that there's a loyalship. I just made up a word. A loyalty. I don't even know what words I combine. A loyalty kind of angle to this for Tim Connolly, right? I mean, he brought Austin Rivers to Denver. He brought him to Minnesota. Patrick Beverley, he's never played for Tim Connolly or for Tim Connolly's teams. Connolly traded him away. So was Connolly going to waive and eat Glenn Taylor's money to waive a veteran to sign another veteran who arguably, like Rivers brings you more punch offensively, even if it's not efficient? Like, I understand the argument. All that to say, if I was Tim Connolly, I would have done it. But Tim Connolly wasn't with the team last year. Tim Connolly was with Austin Rivers in Denver. So I get why it didn't happen. I didn't think it would happen. And that's why it didn't happen in Minnesota. Kevin Love, so I should say Beverly's going to Chicago, of course, where he's from. So that's a good story. Good for Pat Bev. There's always next offseason, right? Who knows? Of course, Rivers will be a free agent. Maybe we can reset things at that point. Kevin Love bought out by Cleveland, which we'd heard for a long time that wouldn't happen. Then he fell out of the rotation there. And sure enough, they let him go. He ends up in Miami, which seems to be a pretty perfect fit for Kevin Love. So hopefully that turns out well for him, and hopefully it doesn't haunt the Cavs in the playoffs. You never know. And then Russell Westbrook, who I don't know what's going on, but I guess multiple teams wanted Russell Westbrook. He's apparently signing with the Clippers. That's what the word is. So Westbrook to the Clippers, Pat Bev to the Bulls, Kevin Love to the Heat. The Wolves not apparently too active in any of them. Pat Bev would be the only one they would have had interest in. So good for him. Last thing here on the show today, Anthony Edwards made some comments at AllStar Weekend. He was asked what one thing he would change about today's NBA and gave a really thoughtful answer about guys resting and load management, and saying he would change it so that guys had to play. And he went on to say, I'm paraphrasing, something to the effect of, if you're 70, 80%, you have to play. And then talked about people that, fans that come to games, they may only have enough money to come to one game a year. And he doesn't want that to be the game that he misses because a fan wanted to see him and isn't going to be able to come to another game that season, which is such a thoughtful and well-reasoned response that and Ant does this, right? Like he does this occasionally where he'll have these really mature answers to questions. And then, of course, he had the issues in the offseason with the insensitive comments he made on social media. And he's put his foot in his mouth before, right? But then he has these moments where it's like he's really thought this through and he gets it. And so this was a really, again, I think thoughtful is the best way to say it. Aware comment, right? And he's played in every game this season, right? He's very rarely sat out in the first 2.5, 2 and 3/4 seasons of his NBA career. So he has a leg to stand on here. And we know that Ant has been banged up. We know he's had the knee. We know he's had some ankle stuff the past year. So, and he's 21 years old, right? It's easier for him to say that than it is for somebody who's in their early 30s. But I thought it was a really mature response. And I thought it was really, people want to hear that from their stars. They want to hear that they're aware of their fans. They're cognizant of what their fans go through as much as possible. And the fact that Ant is not so insulated that he didn't, that he wouldn't be willing to make a comment like that, a very transparent comment. I think that was great. I think it was really, really good. And who knows? I mean, the league, obviously, Adam Silver said that he didn't think it was a big issue, but of course, then there's also the issue of the All-Star game itself and the lack of, I didn't say this much on Monday when I talked about it on the show, but the lack of try that we have in that game was pretty bad this year. And it's a much bigger topic, but I think Ant clearly has some level of awareness here when it comes to the goings on with the load management stuff and fans and what fans are wanting to see. So kudos to Ant for that response. I think he showed some maturity there. And I think in general with the media since the start of this season, I think maybe he learned some things the last couple of years. I think he's continuing to do a better job and in a very real way too. It's not canned. It's not scripted. It's not too good to be true. Like, some other players occasionally that's what it feels like with media, and with Ant, it feels real. And I think he's showing the fact that he's maturing as a professional and as an NBA player. So kudos to Ant on that response. I thought that was well thought out. Well done. All right. The rest of the week here on the show, of course, Friday, the Wolves play. So Friday, we will preview the Wolves-Hornets matchup. Before then, I do want to get to some second half predictions, focusing on some individual player performances, what I think could happen in the second season. And then also give kind of an updated, I'll revisit my actual record prediction for the Timberwolves. I think I did this when they were at the 50% schedule mark, but I want to predict how I think they'll finish the year, the last 21 games, where they'll finish. And then I'll update my Western Conference predictions. Don't worry, at the end of the year, I will give, I'll go back to my start of the year predictions and see how I did. And then also my All-Star break predictions and see what happens over the final, 6 weeks or so, 7 weeks of the regular season. So we'll do all that still this week before we get to Wolves Hornets on Friday. A big thank you to those of you that do make Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere. That includes YouTube as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. You can also watch the show on Locked On Sports Minnesota. That's a Roku and Amazon Fire TV app. Of course, also on YouTube. You can watch it there too. You can also follow the show on Twitter at Locked On T-Wolves and also at Beecken. And that's with 2 B's, 2 E's, C-K-E-N. Of course, the Locked On Wolves podcast is part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Remember, the Locked On Network is your local experts on all the biggest stories. Now make your second listen the Game to Game NBA podcast every moment, every top performance, and every result. Locked On Game to Game covers every game from across the NBA with local analysis that only Locked On can deliver. Follow Game to Game on Locked On NBA, available on the Odyssey app, YouTube, and wherever you get your podcasts. Once again, I'm Ben Beecken. This is the Locked On Wolves podcast, and we'll catch you next time.